In the quiet corners of history, where shadows lengthen and the voices of the past whisper softly, one figure has lingered just out of reach: Mary Magdalene. Known to many as a devoted follower of Jesus, a repentant sinner, or simply a saint, her story has been told and retold for centuries, yet the full measure of her life and influence has been deliberately obscured. The narratives that survive are fragments, scattered across time, filtered through the pens of those who may have sought to rewrite her legacy. And yet, hints remain, subtle traces that suggest her life extended far beyond the pages of the New Testament. Somewhere in the winding hills of Provence, in the forgotten valleys of medieval Europe, whispers of a woman of extraordinary insight and hidden wisdom persisted. She was more than a disciple. Some legends suggest she carried teachings, relics, and knowledge so powerful that the custodians of religious orthodoxy feared it. These stories speak of secret journeys, hidden communities, and sacred objects entrusted to her care, artifacts that could change the way we understand the spiritual and political landscape of medieval kingdoms. What if these legends are more than myth? What if there exists a legacy deliberately erased, yet echoing faintly through the centuries? The intrigue begins not in grand cathedrals or royal courts, but in the quiet places where history meets legend. We find ourselves at the threshold of a story that intertwines faith, power, and secrecy, a tale that travels along the forgotten pathways of Europe and into the hearts of kingdoms that shaped the continent. Mary Magdalene, according to these whispers, did not vanish into obscurity. Instead, her influence quietly spread, leaving hidden traces in documents, art, and sacred sites that few dare to interpret. The question that haunts scholars and mystics alike is simple yet profound. Why has her story been muted, reframed, or even vilified for centuries? Was it because she challenged patriarchal structures, or because her knowledge threatened the very foundation of institutional authority? Perhaps it was both, or perhaps the truth lies in layers too subtle for ordinary eyes to perceive. What remains undeniable is the persistence of her presence. Even when history attempted to erase her, echoes of her life and teachings continued to resonate, hidden in plain sight. Imagine, for a moment, wandering through a shadowed medieval crypt, candlelight flickering against the cold stone walls. Here, a monk carefully copies an ancient manuscript, preserving encoded symbols and marginal notes what the official records cannot acknowledge. Elsewhere, a noble family quietly venerates a chalice or relic associated with a woman whose true story has been denied to the world. Across the landscapes of France, Italy, and beyond, the footprints of Mary Magdalene's legacy are scattered like seeds, waiting for discovery. Each artifact, each whispered story, is a piece of a puzzle that may redefine how we understand the intersection of faith, power, and feminine wisdom in medieval Europe. Yet, this is not a tale confined to dusty libraries or remote churches. Its consequences ripple into the modern imagination, influencing writers, historians, and seekers who chase shadows of truth. From the controversial bloodline theories to hidden symbols and sacred art, the fascination with Mary Magdalene has never faded. The deeper we peer into her story, the more we uncover a world of secrets so carefully veiled that even now, centuries later, scholars debate what is fact and what is deliberate deception. As we embark on this journey through time, prepare to leave behind the familiar and enter a realm where history is not always what it seems. The story of Mary Magdalene is more than a biblical account. It is a labyrinth of mystery, a thread connecting early Christian teachings to medieval politics, secret societies, and hidden knowledge that may still resonate in ways we have yet to understand. Every legend, every relic, every coded manuscript is a testament to a legacy that refuses to be forgotten. In this exploration, We will trace her footsteps from the sunlit shores of Judea to the misty landscapes of medieval Europe. We will uncover suppressed manuscripts, cryptic symbols, and tales preserved by those who dared to keep her memory alive. And as each layer is revealed, we will begin to see a pattern, a tapestry of influence, power, and secrecy that hints at a truth deliberately buried, yet enduring across centuries. Mary Magdalene's lost legacy is not merely a story of the past. It is a journey into the hidden forces that shaped kingdoms, guided faith, and preserved wisdom against the tide of suppression. Tonight, we begin that journey, stepping quietly into the shadows where history and legend converge, where secrets wait patiently for those who are willing to see them. The echoes of her life call to us, and as we listen closely, the hidden chapters of medieval kingdoms begin to whisper their truths. Mary Magdalene's life has always existed at the delicate intersection of history and legend, a place where truth is tangled with myth and the lines between fact and fiction blur. In the official biblical accounts, she appears briefly but powerfully, a devoted follower of Jesus, present at critical moments, and the first to witness the resurrection. Yet, these references, though significant, offer only fleeting glimpses. Beyond them, a shadowy tapestry emerges, one woven from centuries of interpretation, conjecture, and deliberate suppression. For centuries, the image of Mary Magdalene has been carefully constructed by the prevailing authorities of the Church. She became, in the popular imagination, the repentant sinner, the redeemed prostitute, a cautionary figure meant to exemplify the power of forgiveness. Her deeper roles, her spiritual insight, and perhaps her proximity to esoteric teachings were deliberately muted or erased. The transformation of her narrative was not random. It was a strategic reshaping that reflected a world where the voices of powerful women were often silenced. Yet, if we peel back the layers imposed by centuries of institutional control, a different Mary Magdalene begins to emerge. One who is not merely a follower, but a teacher, a keeper of sacred wisdom, and potentially a pivotal figure in the early Christian movement. Gnostic texts, hidden from mainstream audiences for centuries, depict her as a favored disciple, someone entrusted with knowledge even the apostles did not fully understand. These writings portray a Magdalene who questioned, instructed, and guided, embodying a spiritual authority that may have threatened patriarchal structures in both the fledgling church and later societies. The tension between the official Mary Magdalene and the one preserved in legend reveals a broader truth about history itself. It is rarely neutral. The stories that survive are often those sanctioned by power, while alternative narratives are quietly pushed into the margins. In the case of Magdalene, this meant that her most radical roles, teacher, visionary, and perhaps even leader, were obscured, leaving behind only hints and cryptic references scattered across the centuries. What remains is a fragmented portrait, requiring careful reconstruction from manuscripts, marginalia, and oral traditions that survive the sweep of orthodoxy. Some of the earliest clues come from the apocryphal Gospels, texts that were never canonized, yet offer extraordinary glimpses of Magdalene's influence. In these writings, she is not merely a follower. She is a confidant to Christ, privy to secrets that even the apostles did not grasp. Her dialogues suggest deep philosophical and spiritual insight, challenging conventional interpretations of early Christian teachings. She appears as a figure capable of interpreting the mysteries of life and death, a bridge between divine wisdom and human understanding. The suppression of these texts, often burned or hidden by church authorities, underscores the power that her knowledge may have wielded. As centuries passed, her story became further entangled with folklore and legend, particularly as Christianity spread into Europe. Local traditions in Provence, southern France, suggest that she traveled there after the crucifixion, carrying with her not just relics or manuscripts, but a body of spiritual knowledge. Over time, these stories merged with regional myths, giving rise to a figure both human and mystical, someone who could inspire devotion, provoke fear, and command secrecy all at once. These legends painted Magdalene as a wandering sage, an enigmatic presence whose life extended far beyond the biblical accounts, leaving traces in the sacred landscapes of Europe. Yet, even as these alternative narratives flourished in local memory, they were often dismissed by mainstream historians as folklore or superstition. Herein lies the paradox. The very elements that make her story extraordinary, the secret journeys, the mystical wisdom, the possible guardianship of sacred relics, are the same reasons it was obscured. History, in its orthodox form, is selective, preserving what is convenient and erasing what challenges established hierarchies. In this context, Magdalene's story becomes a case study in the fragility of memory, the fragility of truth, and the lengths to which those in power will go to control narrative. The contrast between history and legend is not merely academic. It is tangible in the physical remnants that survive. Churches, chapels, and monasteries dedicated to her, or associated with her in local tradition, contain artwork and symbols that hint at her deeper significance. Stained glass windows, frescoes, and crypt inscriptions speak of a Magdalene who transcends simple labels, whose image was layered with meaning by those who understood her true spiritual authority. Scholars who study these artifacts often describe a sense of intentional concealment, as if her true role was meant to be recognized only by those initiated into certain hidden truths. This shadowy duality between the Magdalene of sanctioned history and the Magdalene of hidden lore sets the stage for a deeper exploration into medieval Europe. The kingdoms that rose after the fall of Rome were fertile ground for legends to flourish, yet they were also arenas of political and religious control where dangerous knowledge could be suppressed or manipulated. As we follow the trail of her legacy through these kingdoms, we begin to see a pattern. Magdalene's story is not lost because it lacks significance. It is lost because it carries a potency that the guardians of orthodoxy could not allow to spread freely. Her presence in the shadows, persistent yet obscured, becomes a symbol of the tension between revelation and suppression, between spiritual authority and institutional control. To trace her legacy is to enter a world where the line between myth and reality blurs, where every clue may reveal a hidden truth, and where every suppressed story leaves an echo waiting to be heard. It is within this liminal space, between history as recorded and legend as whispered, that Mary Magdalene's enduring influence begins to surface, inviting us to question everything we thought we knew about her and the medieval world she may have quietly shaped. Long after the final echoes of the crucifixion faded into the hills of Judea, the story of Mary Magdalene did not end. According to whispered legends preserved in the quiet corners of history, she embarked on a journey that would take her far beyond the familiar landscapes of the Holy Land. Across seas and mountains, she traveled to the sun-drenched regions of southern France, a land that would become the unexpected repository of her legacy. It is here, amid the misty valleys and limestone cliffs of Provence, that her presence became a living memory, woven into local folklore, sacred sites, and the hidden currents of European spirituality. The tale of her arrival in Gaul is enveloped in mystery. Some accounts suggest she sailed across the Mediterranean, accompanied by a small group of disciples, landing on the shores near modern-day Marseille. Others speak of arduous overland journeys, guided by divine purpose and unwavering resolve. Wherever she came from, the evidence points to a profound impact on the regions she visited. Churches, caves, and monastic communities would later bear witness to her influence, suggesting a deliberate effort to plant the seeds of a spiritual heritage that would endure through centuries. quietly resisting the erasure imposed by powerful institutions. One of the most compelling sites connected to her journey is the grotto at Saint-Baume, a rugged sanctuary carved into the cliffs of Provence. According to tradition, Mary Magdalene spent the final years of her life here in seclusion, dedicating herself to prayer and contemplation. The cave, now a place of pilgrimage, exudes a sense of timelessness, as if the walls themselves remember the footsteps of a woman whose wisdom transcended her era. Pilgrims speak of a palpable serenity, a quiet energy that lingers in the shadows, a presence that hints at a life lived in profound spiritual devotion, yet shrouded in secrecy. Local legends amplify the mystery. It is said that Mary Magdalene arrived with sacred objects, perhaps relics or manuscripts entrusted to her care, carrying knowledge that could alter the understanding of early Christianity. Some stories even suggest she brought seeds of an alternative spiritual lineage, one that emphasized feminine wisdom and esoteric teachings. These whispers were preserved by communities who revered her, passing down fragments of her story in song, story, and coded symbols etched in stone and frescoes. The secrecy surrounding these tales ensured that, while her presence was remembered, the full scope of her legacy remained concealed from the broader historical record. The journey to Provence, however, was not merely physical. It was symbolic. It represented a migration of spiritual authority, an attempt to safeguard teachings and knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. In the rugged, semi-remote landscapes of southern France, Mary Magdalene found both sanctuary and opportunity. The region, already steeped in a mix of Roman, Gallic, and early Christian influences, provided fertile ground for the propagation of ideas that challenged conventional authority, even subtly. Her legacy, if one follows these accounts, was not merely a personal story of devotion, but the establishment of a living spiritual network whose echoes would persist through medieval Europe. Evidence of her influence in France is scattered yet intriguing. The town of Saint-Maximin-la-Saint-Baume, which later became the site of a grand basilica dedicated to her memory, is said to hold her remains, carefully preserved through centuries of upheaval. Legend suggests that noble families, monks, and later secretive orders were entrusted with safeguarding her relics and the teachings she carried. These custodians acted in quiet defiance of official ecclesiastical authority, ensuring that the Magdalene legacy would survive in forms both tangible and hidden. Art and architecture in the region also hint at her presence. Frescoes, stained glass, and sculpted reliefs depict a woman of serene authority, often in contexts that suggest deeper spiritual meaning than the conventional narrative permits. Her image appears alongside symbols of feminine power, sacred vessels, and mystical emblems that, when interpreted collectively, suggest a hidden network of knowledge and devotion. Scholars have long debated the significance of these symbols, but the pattern they form cannot be ignored. Mary Magdalene's journey to Gaul left enduring traces, preserved in a language of secrecy that only the initiated could fully understand. The importance of Provence in the Magdalene story extends beyond mere geography. It represents a crossroads where cultures, beliefs, and spiritual practices converged, providing an environment in which hidden knowledge could survive. In these valleys and along these cliffs, oral traditions flourished, passing down stories of miracles, teachings, and sacred encounters. The very terrain, difficult to traverse and relatively insulated from central authority, allowed for the quiet protection of a legacy that might otherwise have been destroyed. It is as though the land itself conspired to preserve her story, holding it in shadow until the right seekers arrived to listen. Yet, the story of her migration to France also raises questions that continue to intrigue historians and mystics alike. How much of this is legend, and how much reflects historical reality? Were her journeys guided by divine inspiration, or were they strategic efforts to protect sacred knowledge? Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between, a tapestry of faith, myth, and intentional concealment that defies easy categorization. What is undeniable, however, is the persistent thread of influence. A Magdalene who shaped the spiritual landscape of southern France, leaving a footprint that would ripple through medieval kingdoms, secret societies, and the very fabric of European culture. As we follow the trail of Mary Magdalene through France, we begin to sense a larger pattern. A careful seeding of spiritual wisdom, a deliberate protection of sacred knowledge, and a quiet establishment of a legacy that would challenge conventional narratives for centuries. The road she traveled was both literal and symbolic, winding through landscapes that would become the repositories of her story, hidden in plain sight. By tracing these paths, we do not merely uncover history. We glimpse the deliberate orchestration of memory, devotion, and secrecy that ensured her life and teachings would echo through time, quietly shaping the kingdoms that would rise long after her footsteps faded from view. As the echoes of Mary Magdalene's footsteps settled into the sun-drenched hills of Provence, Europe itself was transforming. The collapse of the Roman Empire had given rise to a patchwork of kingdoms, each vying for power, legitimacy, and spiritual authority. It was a world of shifting borders, fragile alliances, and a church that sought to consolidate influence over lands both newly claimed and long inhabited. In the midst of this turbulent medieval landscape, the whispers of Mary Magdalene's legacy began to intertwine with the ambitions, fears, and secret designs of the emerging rulers. The medieval kingdoms of France, Provence, and neighboring regions were fertile ground for legends and secrets to flourish. Kings and nobles were acutely aware of the power of perception and the control of sacred knowledge. To wield relics, manuscripts, or stories of saints was to wield authority. To suppress them was to maintain dominance. It is within this dynamic that the legacy of Mary Magdalene found a precarious home. Her story, deliberately muted in some circles and celebrated in others, became a subtle instrument in the shaping of both faith and politics. Those who preserved her memory were not merely caretakers of piety. They were custodians of a power that could rival thrones and challenge hierarchies. Accounts of her influence in these kingdoms are scattered but compelling. Some legends suggest that local rulers recognized the potency of her presence and sought to align themselves with it, commissioning chapels and shrines in her honor. Others hint at clandestine guardianship, where her teachings and relics were protected by secretive orders, removed from the scrutiny of the church hierarchy. In monasteries tucked away in remote valleys, monks copied manuscripts containing coded references to her wisdom, ensuring that her spiritual authority endured even when official history attempted to suppress it. These hidden currents, invisible to the public eye, suggest a medieval Europe quietly shaped by the memory of a woman whose life had been deemed too influential, too dangerous to be fully acknowledged. Yet Magdalene's legacy was not solely spiritual. It carried political weight. The intertwining of relics, sacred sites, and noble houses created a network in which stories of her presence became both protective talismans and symbols of legitimacy. To claim a connection to her, even indirectly, was to assert divine favor, to position oneself within a lineage of spiritual authority. This was particularly important in an era where power was often justified by divine mandate. In this way, her story, though muted in official chronicles, became a silent force guiding allegiances, legitimizing rulers, and influencing the very architecture of kingdoms. The landscapes of medieval France themselves bear witness to this hidden influence. Remote abbeys, hidden chapels, and ancient stone carvings contain symbols that, when read with insight, suggest a Magdalene tradition carefully embedded into the spiritual and cultural fabric of the era. From cryptic inscriptions in cloisters to frescoes depicting a figure whose identity is unmistakably Magdalene, These markers act as signposts for those attuned to her legacy. Scholars and historians have often dismissed these details as coincidental or purely decorative. Yet when examined collectively, they form a network of hidden knowledge spanning valleys, mountains, and rivers, a subtle map of her enduring presence. The role of secret orders and custodial networks cannot be overstated. Monks, nuns, and even noble families often acted as protectors of knowledge deemed too dangerous for public disclosure. This included not only relics and manuscripts, but oral traditions and coded teachings that carried spiritual, philosophical, and sometimes even political weight. The Magdalene narrative, preserved in this way, became a hidden thread connecting disparate regions, a silent undercurrent shaping the moral and cultural framework of medieval society. These custodians understood that to reveal too much could provoke persecution or annihilation, yet to hide her fully would risk the loss of wisdom whose value could span generations. Interwoven with these sacred secrets were the broader tensions of medieval Europe. The Church, striving for doctrinal control, often perceived any alternative spiritual lineage as a threat. Here, the Magdalene legacy was both shielded and endangered. Communities that revered her quietly navigated the dangers of orthodoxy, balancing devotion with discretion. In doing so, they created an invisible web of influence, a Magdalene-inspired ethos that guided morality, leadership, and even governance in subtle ways. It is possible that some rulers, consciously or not, were guided by principles that originated in her teachings, principles that emphasize compassion, wisdom, and an understanding of spiritual authority that differed from the patriarchal norms being enforced elsewhere. Moreover, the mystical aura surrounding Mary Magdalene amplified her significance. Legends tell of visions, divine encounters, and miraculous acts attributed to her memory, suggesting that her influence extended beyond doctrine and into lived experience. Pilgrimages to sites associated with her, such as Saint Baume, became a form of spiritual networking, a way to transmit knowledge, reinforce authority, and sustain devotion across generations. These journeys, often undertaken in secrecy or within tightly knit communities, allowed her story to endure in a way that official histories could not erase. Even in the face of political turbulence, her presence persisted, subtly guiding the hearts and minds of those who followed her example or sought her protection. The combination of sacred relics, secret teachings, and mystical lore created a paradoxical influence, powerful yet hidden, revered yet deliberately obscured. In this way, medieval kingdoms became custodians of a dual narrative, one that celebrated her publicly in symbols and local legends, and one that preserved her teachings in hidden forms. This duality, tension between visibility and concealment, reflects the very essence of her legacy. A woman whose life was too potent to be erased, yet too controversial to be fully acknowledged. To understand Mary Magdalene's impact on medieval kingdoms, we must consider the subtleties of power. Influence did not always manifest in overt control or political office. Often it operated through whispered traditions, coded manuscripts, and sacred spaces imbued with memory. It is in these spaces, crypts, caves, and cloisters, that we begin to see the full scope of her presence. Each hidden relic, each clandestine text, and each whispered story served as both protection and guidance, ensuring that her legacy continued to shape the moral, spiritual, and even political landscape of Europe long after her passing. The medieval kingdoms, with their fragile alliances and overlapping authorities, became the perfect stage for the survival of her story. Here, secrecy was a necessity, yet preservation was imperative. The resulting tapestry is one of extraordinary subtlety, a Magdalene legacy that influenced kings, monks, and common people alike, often in ways imperceptible to those who recorded history. It is a reminder that history is rarely linear, and that truths of profound significance often lie hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the patient and the perceptive to uncover them. In tracing these currents, one begins to see that Mary Magdalene's journey to Gaul was far more than an isolated pilgrimage. It was the beginning of a network, a quiet revolution of knowledge and spiritual authority, whose threads would wind their way through medieval Europe. Her legacy, though veiled, shaped kingdoms not through conquest, but through devotion, secrecy, and the careful preservation of wisdom too powerful for the mainstream record. In this hidden history, the echoes of her presence reverberate across centuries, inviting modern seekers to trace the steps of a woman whose life was extraordinary, whose influence was profound, and whose story remains, in many ways, unfinished. As Mary Magdalene's journey through Europe unfolded, whispers of her influence evolved into something even more tantalizing: the idea of a hidden bloodline, a lineage quietly preserved through the centuries, shrouded in secrecy and myth. This is a legacy not merely of teachings or relics, but of living descendants, individuals who may have carried her wisdom, her spiritual authority, and perhaps even her genetic line into medieval kingdoms. It is a concept that blurs the boundary between legend and history, provoking fascination, skepticism, and controversy in equal measure. The notion of a Magdalene bloodline is not a modern invention. Medieval European lore contains subtle hints of families claiming sacred connections, sometimes veiled in cryptic symbolism, coats of arms, or clandestine genealogies. These claims often intersect with stories of saints, holy relics, and mystical teachings, suggesting a deliberate effort to preserve a lineage whose significance extended far beyond the public eye. The secrecy surrounding such families points to an understanding that this was a heritage too powerful to expose openly, a legacy that could challenge both spiritual and political authority if revealed. Some theories suggest that Mary Magdalene's supposed descendants intermarried with noble families in southern France, weaving her influence into the very fabric of medieval power. Over generations, these bloodlines could have shaped the course of history in subtle ways, guiding rulers, influencing religious institutions, or safeguarding secret knowledge. While concrete evidence remains elusive, the very persistence of these legends hints at a pattern. Stories of hidden heirs that survived centuries of upheaval, war, and social transformation, preserved through coded language, oral tradition, and careful stewardship. Historical texts occasionally provide tantalizing fragments. References to mysterious figures, unnamed women of spiritual authority, or noble heirs with unusual claims of divine favor have sparked debate among scholars and enthusiasts alike. Some argue these fragments are coincidental or mythologized over time, yet the recurrence of similar motifs in disparate regions suggests a deliberate narrative. The idea of a Magdalene lineage was not a casual invention. It was a concept maintained with intention, a thread of influence that extended into the hidden corners of medieval society. The allure of the bloodline also lies in its connection to sacred artifacts. Some traditions suggest that relics or manuscripts entrusted to Mary Magdalene were passed down within this hidden lineage, reinforcing both spiritual and symbolic authority. These objects were not merely ceremonial. They were considered vessels of knowledge, power, and divine connection. Families believed to be part of this bloodline may have served as guardians, ensuring that the wisdom she carried was preserved, interpreted correctly, and transmitted only to those deemed worthy. This convergence of lineage and sacred duty transforms the idea of bloodline into something far more profound, a living continuum of spiritual influence, capable of shaping events and ideas across generations. Yet the concept of a Magdalene bloodline is as much about mystery as it is about genealogy. The secrecy surrounding it may have been necessary to protect against persecution, whether from religious authorities or political rivals. In an era where heresy could lead to execution, families with claims of sacred descent would have had every reason to conceal their lineage. The result is a tantalizing puzzle: scattered references, cryptic symbols, and oral traditions that hint at continuity without ever fully revealing it. This deliberate obscuration only adds to the allure, leaving historians and seekers alike to piece together the faint traces left behind. Modern interest in the Magdalene bloodline is fueled as much by imagination as by scholarship. Authors, researchers, and mystics have attempted to trace its supposed path through medieval Europe, connecting noble houses, hidden monasteries, and mysterious figures in ways that suggest continuity. While mainstream historians often dismiss these connections as speculative, the very persistence of the narrative over centuries points to something more than simple invention. Whether myth, metaphor, or historical reality, the idea of a lineage dedicated to preserving Mary Magdalene's influence continues to captivate those who seek the hidden threads of history. There are also fascinating intersections between the bloodline and esoteric traditions. Some Gnostic texts and mystical writings describe a transmission of spiritual authority through familial lines, hinting that knowledge could be safeguarded not only in texts or relics, but in living descendants. In this view, the Magdalene bloodline is more than genealogy. It is a vessel for continuity, a way of embedding sacred wisdom into the ongoing flow of human history. If true, it transforms our understanding of power and secrecy in medieval Europe, suggesting that influence could travel not only through politics or religion, but through blood itself. Skeptics, of course, caution against conflating legend with fact. There is little verifiable evidence that Mary Magdalene had biological descendants, and many medieval claims may have been symbolic rather than literal. Yet the consistency of the narratives, the recurrence of motifs, and the deliberate secrecy that surrounds them invite serious consideration. Perhaps the value of the bloodline lies not in proving biological descent, but in tracing the enduring impact of her teachings, her symbolic authority, and the reverence she inspired. In other words, whether literal or metaphorical, the concept of a lineage preserves her influence across centuries, allowing her presence to echo in subtle and unexpected ways. The tension between myth and reality, skepticism and speculation, mirrors the broader duality of Mary Magdalene's story itself. Just as her life straddles history and legend, so too does the notion of a bloodline occupy a liminal space between tangible truth and imaginative reconstruction. It is this tension that fuels fascination, ensuring that the idea of a Magdalene lineage continues to inspire inquiry, debate, and storytelling. Whether real or allegorical, it is a symbol of her enduring power, a testament to a woman whose life, teachings, and perhaps descendants could quietly shape the course of kingdoms and the trajectory of hidden knowledge. In contemplating the Magdalene bloodline, one begins to see the contours of a hidden medieval network, families, communities, and sacred custodians linked by devotion, secrecy, and a shared mission to preserve a legacy too profound to be openly acknowledged. This network may have operated in the shadows, influencing the politics, religion, and culture of Europe in subtle but enduring ways. And whether or not we can ever fully trace its existence, the idea itself compels us to reconsider what history leaves untold, what knowledge is deliberately obscured, and how one woman's life could ripple across centuries in ways both mysterious and transformative. Mary Magdalene's journey through time, legend, and hidden influence is inseparable from the tangible remnants left in her wake. Sacred relics, manuscripts, and artifacts whose presence evokes both wonder and suspicion. Across centuries, these objects have become the silent witnesses of her legacy, carrying traces of spiritual authority, esoteric knowledge, and the mystery of a woman whose story was deliberately suppressed. Yet their survival has always been precarious, subject to the whims of power, war, and religious orthodoxy. The relics themselves are more than mere objects. They are vessels of memory, carefully safeguarded by those who understood their potency. Among the most famous are relics said to have belonged directly to Mary Magdalene, ranging from personal items to sacred containers for holy substances. Churches in Provence, particularly in Saint-Maximin-la-Saint-Baume, claim to hold fragments of her bones, preserved in elaborate reliquaries, carefully guarded through centuries of political and religious turmoil. Pilgrims who visit these sites speak of a palpable energy, an almost tangible sense of presence that transcends the ordinary. Whether spiritual or psychological, the effect of these relics is undeniable. They anchor a story that might otherwise have dissolved into myth, giving shape to a legacy that is both physical and symbolic. Other artifacts, however, are more mysterious, their origins and authenticity shrouded in secrecy. Ancient manuscripts, some hidden in monastic libraries or private collections, contain cryptic references to Mary Magdalene, encoded teachings, or illustrations of her role in ways that mainstream historians rarely acknowledge. These texts are often fragmented, written in languages or scripts that required specialized knowledge to interpret, suggesting intentional concealment. To stumble upon one of these manuscripts is to glimpse a hidden world, a medieval Europe where knowledge of Magdalene's significance was preserved, protected, and passed down in whispers rather than proclamations. One of the most compelling aspects of these relics is their connection to the sacred feminine. Across Europe, various chalices, veils, and symbolic vessels have been associated with Mary Magdalene, suggesting a spiritual lineage that emphasized her role as a custodian of divine wisdom. The symbolism is striking. Objects that are both utilitarian and sacred, mundane yet imbued with power, echoing the dual nature of Magdalene herself. It is not difficult to imagine that these artifacts were more than ceremonial. They were teaching tools, markers of authority, and perhaps even keys to esoteric knowledge intended only for those prepared to understand it. The precarious journey of these relics through history underscores the constant tension between reverence and erasure. Wars, invasions, and religious purges threatened their existence. Yet they survived, often hidden in crypts, buried beneath church floors, or relocated to private collections. Each relocation was an act of both preservation and defiance, a silent rebellion against those who sought to erase Mary Magdalene's story. The fact that any of these relics remain today is a testament to the vigilance and devotion of those who understood their importance, a hidden network of custodians who operated beyond the reach of official scrutiny. Relics were not the only objects of significance. Everyday items attributed to her, such as personal garments, combs, or chalices, became objects of veneration, symbols of her enduring presence, and sometimes focal points for pilgrimage and devotion. Their survival is remarkable given the fragility of medieval materials and the turbulence of history. Each artifact acts as a bridge between the living and the legendary, offering a tactile connection to a woman whose life has been veiled in secrecy yet never entirely forgotten. The loss of many other items amplifies their allure. Countless objects associated with Mary Magdalene are said to have vanished, burned, stolen, or hidden so deeply that their existence is now almost purely legendary. Medieval chronicles occasionally reference miraculous chalices or manuscripts, only for their trail to disappear into the shadows of history. This absence, paradoxically, heightens their significance. What is lost invites speculation, mystery, and imagination. The lost artifacts are as much a part of her legacy as the ones preserved, hinting at a story deliberately fragmented, leaving future generations to piece together the narrative from scattered clues. The reverence for these relics was not merely devotional, it was strategic. Those who safeguarded them understood the power inherent in objects associated with a woman whose influence threatened orthodox narratives. Relics could confer legitimacy, attract pilgrims, and inspire loyalty, both spiritual and political. Possessing a relic of Mary Magdalene was not simply an act of faith. It was a statement of alignment with her hidden authority, a tangible declaration that her presence and wisdom endured despite centuries of suppression. Art and symbolism often accompanied these relics, creating layers of meaning that extended their influence beyond the physical. Manuscripts might be illuminated with cryptic imagery, relics housed in ornate shrines adorned with symbols of the sacred feminine. These visual cues functioned as both protective measures and teaching tools, ensuring that only the initiated could fully comprehend their significance. In essence, every artifact became a coded message, a fragment of a larger narrative carefully hidden in plain sight. Modern fascination with Mary Magdalene's relics and artifacts continues unabated. Scholars, archaeologists, and seekers of esoteric knowledge have retraced her paths, investigated churches, and studied manuscripts for hidden references to her life and influence. Some discoveries have revived interest in her story, while others remain tantalizingly inconclusive, perpetuating the tension between myth and history. Each artifact, whether verified or legendary, serves as a doorway into a medieval Europe where hidden wisdom and spiritual authority quietly shape societies, influencing both faith and governance in ways often invisible to official records. Ultimately, the sacred relics and lost artifacts of Mary Magdalene are more than objects. They're symbols of endurance, secrecy, and hidden influence. They remind us that her legacy is not confined to stories or texts alone. It is material, tactile, and powerful. These relics are echoes of a past in which knowledge was carefully guarded, a past where one woman's influence could challenge the authority of kings and priests alike. They stand as silent witnesses to a life that defied erasure, a testament to a legacy that continues to inspire, intrigue, and haunt those who seek the truths buried within the shadows of history. In contemplating these relics, we are drawn into a world where every object carries meaning, every hidden manuscript hints at knowledge, and every fragment of preserved history whispers of secrets too powerful to be openly acknowledged. The artifacts associated with Mary Magdalene are the anchors of her legacy, the tangible proof that, even in a world intent on erasure, her influence persisted. Through them, we glimpse a medieval Europe where spiritual authority, devotion, and secrecy intersected, creating a hidden narrative whose resonance still echoes today, inviting us to explore, question, and wonder. As Mary Magdalene's legacy wove itself into the landscapes of medieval Europe, it found its most steadfast guardians not among kings or politicians, but within the quiet, shadowed walls of monasteries and convents. These institutions, often cloistered and remote, became the keepers of knowledge too powerful, too dangerous, or too sacred for the broader world to see. Here, in the hush of candlelit scriptoriums and echoing cloisters, monks and nuns meticulously copied manuscripts, safeguarded relics, and preserved the whispered stories of a woman whose influence was systematically suppressed elsewhere. Their devotion ensured that her teachings, whether spiritual, mystical, or practical, would endure, hidden yet potent. The network of custodians was far from uniform. Some were solitary hermits, retreating into caves or secluded abbeys to meditate upon Magdalene's teachings. Others were part of monastic orders, bound by oaths of secrecy and obedience, sworn to protect her relics and manuscripts at any cost. The work of these custodians was both spiritual and political. Possessing a relic or manuscript associated with Mary Magdalene could confer legitimacy, prestige, or even authority, and so her guardians operated carefully, balancing devotion with discretion. In doing so, they created a web of influence that extended quietly across kingdoms, invisible to those who recorded mainstream history. Secret orders also played a vital role in preserving her legacy. While the most famous of these, such as the Knights Templar, are often romanticized in modern imagination, there is evidence that other, lesser-known groups may have safeguarded knowledge associated with Mary Magdalene. These orders were often cloaked in layers of symbolism, their teachings encoded in manuscripts, rituals, and architecture. By embedding her story in allegory and metaphor, they ensured that only those with the necessary insight or initiation could fully comprehend its significance. This was not mere precaution, it was survival. Knowledge associated with her life and influence could be construed as heretical, and secrecy was essential to avoid persecution. Monastic custodians understood that their role was both protective and educational. Manuscripts preserved in monasteries often contain not just religious instruction, but cryptic references, coded language, and allegorical illustrations pointing to Magdalene's teachings and journeys. These were carefully copied and recopied, their meanings layered and subtle, ensuring that the knowledge survived in a form that could withstand centuries of scrutiny, war, and censorship. The monks and nuns who undertook this labor were part of a silent revolution, guarding wisdom that could influence the spiritual and cultural currents of entire kingdoms. The preservation of Mary Magdalene's relics was similarly meticulous. Sacred objects, whether bones, vessels, or personal items, were hidden within walls, buried beneath chapels, or entrusted to specific families or monastic orders. Some relics were relocated multiple times, a testament to the dangers they faced from invaders, church authorities, or political rivals. In every case, the guardianship of these objects was a deliberate act, a pledge to protect a story and a legacy deemed too potent to be lost. The care with which these relics were preserved suggests an awareness of their significance, not only as sacred artifacts, but as symbols of a lineage, a hidden spiritual authority, and a network of influence stretching across Europe. Stories and oral traditions were also preserved within these monastic communities. Certain chants, prayers, or ritual practices contain subtle allusions to Mary Magdalene's role, often disguised in metaphor or embedded within liturgy. By encoding her story in these forms, custodians ensured continuity while minimizing exposure. This created a layered history, one that could be celebrated publicly in ways deemed acceptable, and another, hidden and protected, carrying the full measure of her teachings and influence. The duality of public observance and private preservation is a hallmark of Magdalene's medieval legacy, revealing how knowledge and devotion could coexist with the politics of suppression. The geographic placement of monasteries and convents was no accident. Many were situated in remote, difficult-to-access regions, high in mountains, deep in forests, or along hidden valleys, providing natural protection for their treasures and teachings. These locations allowed custodians to maintain secrecy while still engaging with networks of disciples and local communities. Pilgrims who sought Magdalene's wisdom often undertook arduous journeys, a test of devotion and a way to ensure that only the committed could access the knowledge contained within these cloisters. The journey itself became part of the spiritual experience, reinforcing the sacred nature of the teachings and the relics they sought. The interaction between monastic custodians and secular authorities was often delicate. Kings, nobles, and clerical leaders occasionally recognized the value of these sacred relics and manuscripts, commissioning or supporting the monasteries in exchange for spiritual legitimacy or protection. Yet the custodians maintained an independence, quietly safeguarding the knowledge even when political winds shifted. Their vigilance ensured that Mary Magdalene's legacy could survive wars, inquisitions, and societal upheaval, becoming an enduring presence that transcended the limitations of official history. The secrecy maintained by these monastic custodians created an aura of mystique that endures to this day. Scholars attempting to trace the origins of certain manuscripts or relics often encounter cryptic annotations, marginalia, or coded imagery, hinting at knowledge preserved for those with the insight to understand it. The meticulous attention to detail, the careful layering of symbolism, and the insistence on secrecy all point to a deliberate and sophisticated effort to maintain a hidden narrative, one in which Mary Magdalene's influence remained intact despite centuries of suppression. Ultimately, the monastic custodians and secret orders were the quiet architects of Mary Magdalene's enduring presence in medieval Europe. Through their careful stewardship, they preserved not only relics and manuscripts, but an entire worldview that emphasized spiritual insight, hidden wisdom, and the subtle power of secrecy. They acted as intermediaries between the visible world of kingdoms, churches, and public devotion, and the hidden currents of knowledge that flowed through Europe like an invisible river. Their labor ensured that her teachings, her artifacts, and perhaps even the echo of a hidden lineage continued to survive, waiting for the seekers, the scholars, and the dreamers who would one day follow the trail she left behind. In understanding these custodians, we glimpse the mechanism by which Mary Magdalene's story endured despite attempts to erase it. The quiet vigilance of monasteries and secret orders preserved her teachings, her relics, and the memory of her influence, creating a bridge between the spiritual currents of the ancient world and the medieval kingdom she touched. In the shadows of these cloisters, her presence never faded. It endured, silent but profound, waiting for the centuries when her story would once again be sought, questioned, and perhaps finally understood. Among the most tantalizing threads of Mary Magdalene's hidden legacy are the manuscripts that survive, fragments of knowledge, meticulously copied and concealed, waiting to be deciphered by those who know how to look. These are not ordinary texts. They are codices filled with cryptic symbols, marginal annotations, and allegorical illustrations that hint at teachings deemed too controversial or too powerful for public consumption. Across medieval Europe, these manuscripts formed a silent network, carrying the memory of a woman whose story was deliberately obscured and whose influence may have quietly shaped the spiritual landscape of kingdoms and monasteries alike. The very existence of these texts underscores the tension between revelation and suppression. While official church doctrines sought to standardize belief and erase alternative narratives, hidden manuscripts preserved her teachings, her journeys, and sometimes even the traces of her supposed bloodline. Scholars who have examined these codices often describe a duality. The overt content appears conventional, pious, and in line with accepted theology, but the margins and illustrations contain a subtler, more esoteric language. Here, in the margins, are clues pointing to wisdom meant only for the attentive, the initiated, and the devoted. Many of these lost manuscripts were preserved in monasteries and convents scattered across France, Italy, and southern Europe. Some were hidden within secret chambers or buried beneath floors. Others were passed quietly from hand to hand, safeguarded by families and secret orders who recognized their significance. The texts themselves often defy simple categorization. Some resemble Gnostic Gospels, presenting dialogues and teachings of Mary Magdalene not found in canonical texts. Others are collections of prayers, meditations, or allegorical stories, their meanings layered and coded. Together, they form a hidden library, a fragmented but persistent record of knowledge that the mainstream historical record has largely ignored. The margins of these manuscripts hold particular fascination. In the hands of medieval scribes, the smallest annotation, a doodle, a marginal note, or a cryptic symbol, could carry immense significance. Some scholars argue that these notes were intended as guides for understanding deeper truths, perhaps pointing to interpretations of Magdalene's teachings that were deliberately concealed from the wider world. Others suggest that they contained encoded instructions for locating relics, sacred sites, or even tracing her supposed lineage. In either case, the margin notes act as a bridge between the visible and the hidden, inviting the reader to engage in an intellectual and spiritual puzzle that spans centuries. Illustrations within the codices are equally compelling. In many cases, Mary Magdalene is depicted not merely as a follower of Christ, but as a central figure in spiritual instruction, often surrounded by symbols of knowledge, feminine wisdom, or mystical authority. These images may appear subtle, almost incidental, but their recurrence across different manuscripts suggests intentionality. They convey messages about her importance, her teachings, and the hidden network of followers and custodians who sought to preserve her influence against the tides of orthodoxy and political control. The survival of these manuscripts was never guaranteed. Wars, inquisitions, and the systematic destruction of texts deemed heretical threatened to erase them completely. Countless codices were lost to fire, theft, or deliberate censorship. Yet some survived, often by sheer chance, protected by the secrecy and foresight of those who understood their value. Each surviving manuscript is a testament to careful preservation, a bridge between centuries, and a clue to understanding a narrative that mainstream history has often tried to suppress. What makes these manuscripts particularly intriguing is the way they intersect with other forms of Magdalene's legacy. Some codices contain references to relics, sacred sites, or mystical rituals associated with her. Others hint at her interactions with early Christian figures or suggest a spiritual lineage that continued through generations. When studied collectively, they form a network of interlocking evidence, a map of her enduring influence that crosses geography, time, and social strata. The texts are fragments, but together they create a mosaic, a pattern that invites investigation, interpretation, and perhaps revelation. Modern scholars and esoteric researchers have long been captivated by these manuscripts. Attempts to decode their hidden meanings often require knowledge of obscure languages, cipher systems, and symbolic traditions. Yet even when fully translated, the texts resist simple interpretation, leaving open the possibility that parts of her story remain deliberately concealed, waiting for those prepared to uncover them. This uncertainty adds to the mystique. Mary Magdalene's teachings are not just preserved. They are veiled, challenging each generation to engage with her legacy anew. The manuscripts also reveal something deeper about medieval custodianship. The scribes, monks, and nuns who created and preserved these texts understood the delicate balance between accessibility and secrecy. They were not simply recording knowledge. They were constructing a system of protection, encoding wisdom in ways that allowed it to survive without provoking the ire of authorities. In this sense, the manuscripts themselves are as much an artifact of cunning and devotion as they are a repository of spiritual teachings. Each marginal note, symbol, and illustration reflects intentionality, purpose, and an understanding of the precariousness of preserving forbidden knowledge. Ultimately, these lost manuscripts are more than historical curiosities. They are portals into a hidden world. Through them, we glimpse Mary Magdalene not just as a figure of legend, but as a central figure whose influence reverberated quietly yet persistently through medieval Europe. The codices invite us to reconsider the boundaries between history and myth, authority and secrecy, public memory and hidden knowledge. They suggest a continuity of thought and devotion that has survived despite efforts to erase it, leaving a trail of clues for those willing to follow. By studying the margins, decoding symbols, and tracing the path of these lost texts, we begin to piece together a broader picture of her legacy, a legacy not confined to story or relic, but extending into thought, practice, and spiritual guidance. The manuscripts are proof that Mary Magdalene's influence was deliberate, curated, and protected. Even when centuries conspired to obscure her, these codices preserved the whispers of her teachings, ensuring that her presence could be rediscovered, interpreted, and appreciated by those who sought the hidden truths she carried. In this hidden library of medieval Europe, the voice of Mary Magdalene survives. It speaks softly, indirectly, encoded in symbols and marginalia, yet it persists across the centuries. Each codex, each annotation, each hidden illustration is a call to seekers, scholars, and mystics alike, to look closer, to question the narratives handed down, and to uncover the threads of a legacy that, though suppressed, continues to echo across time. Across the medieval world, whispers spread of a mysterious brotherhood whose loyalty lay not merely with kings or popes, but with something older, something hidden beneath the stones of churches and the sands of Jerusalem. The Knights Templar, famed for their discipline, wealth, and battlefield prowess, carried within their ranks an aura of secrecy that historians have never fully dispelled. Yet among all the mysteries surrounding them, none is more captivating than the possibility that they safeguarded a tradition tied to Mary Magdalene herself. If true, it would mean that behind their fortified castles and cryptic rituals lay a spiritual allegiance far older than their order's official founding. To understand why the Templars are so often linked to alternative histories, one must return to the early days of the Crusades, when a small band of knights first vowed to protect pilgrims along the treacherous roads to the Holy Land. No one could have predicted the meteoric rise that awaited them. They were given quarters on the Temple Mount, directly over the ruins of the ancient Jewish temple, a location drenched in layers of sacred memory. Officially, they were simply living in repurposed buildings. Unofficially, rumors claim they excavated beneath those stones, entering forgotten chambers sealed since the time of Rome. The chroniclers of their era remain strangely silent about what was found in those first 9 years. That silence, more than anything they wrote, helped fuel centuries of speculation. Some believe the Templars discovered relics of unparalleled power, scrolls, genealogies, or teachings that diverge from the canonical line of Christian authority. Others suggest they found evidence of an early Christian movement in which Mary Magdalene played a central role, material that, if revealed, could have threatened the spiritual jurisdiction of the medieval church. It is no coincidence that theories linking the Templars to Magdalene often point to the same region of southern France later associated with her legends. The order's influence in Provence, Languedoc, and the foothills of the Pyrenees was deep and lasting, and their massive commanderies stood alongside places where stories of Magdalene had been preserved for centuries. The Templars were not mere soldiers, but administrators, scholars, and builders. Their symbolism, 2 knights riding a single horse, the enigmatic red cross, the architectural precision of their round churches, often invites esoteric interpretation. Round churches, modeled after the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, evoke ancient sanctuaries predating the formal church by centuries. Some researchers propose that the Templars adopted design elements meant to honor a lineage of sacred knowledge lost after the fall of early Christian communities. Within these spaces, initiation rites might have been conducted in near darkness, lit only by candles flickering against curved walls that amplified every whispered vow. If Mary Magdalene truly represented a suppressed stream of spiritual authority, whether through teachings, symbolic lineage, or hidden wisdom, then the Templars, with their unusual independence, would have been one of the few institutions capable of preserving it. Their loyalty was not to local bishops, but directly to the Pope, bypassing intermediaries. This autonomy, combined with their vast network of fortresses and treasuries, made them custodians of secrets that could move across borders, protected by code words and armed escorts. For time, they were untouchable. But power invites scrutiny, and secrecy breeds suspicion. As the Templars grew wealthier and more influential, kings began to fear them. In France, where Magdalene's memory was strongest, King Philip IV saw the order as both an economic obstacle and a political rival. Yet some accounts suggest that Philip's obsession with destroying the Templars stemmed not solely from debts owed to them, but from fear of what they possessed. Documents from Inquisition reveal interrogations filled with strange accusations, worship of a mysterious head, initiation rites involving sacred oils, and veneration of figures not recognized by church doctrine. While many charges were fabricated, their bizarre nature hints that the Inquisitors suspected the Templars of holding alternative theological knowledge. If the order did preserve texts or traditions linked to Magdalene, the sudden and violent purge of 1307 would have placed those secrets in grave danger. Yet history records that on the night before the mass arrests, the Templar fleet vanished from the port of La Rochelle. Dozens of ships slipped into the darkness, destination unknown. What they carried, and whom they carried, remains one of history's great unanswered questions. It is conceivable that along with gold and documents, they transported relics tied to Magdalene's legacy, ensuring that her memory would not be extinguished by royal decree. In the aftermath, surviving Templars scattered across Europe. Some sought refuge in Scotland, others blended into local populations or joined sympathetic noble families. Legends claim that the order did not die, but merely changed form, continuing to safeguard what they once protected under new names and symbols. The mysterious connection between later secret societies and themes of hidden lineage or sacred feminine wisdom may be echoes of what the Templars carried with them into exile. Whether literal or symbolic, the link between Magdalene and the order's surviving strands persists in folklore, architecture, and ritual lore. Travelers visiting old Templar sites often report the same impression, an atmosphere of quiet knowing, as though the stones themselves remember whispers long forgotten. In the commandery of Aragon, in the chapel ruins of Languedoc, and in the round towers of Portugal, one finds carvings of roses, stars, and enigmatic female figures whose meanings were never explained in surviving records. Some see these as remnants of a lost devotional practice, an acknowledgement of a feminine spiritual force once honored but later suppressed. The Templars' apparent reverence for wisdom traditions outside Orthodox Christianity only deepens the possibility of such interpretations. Today, scholars debate the Templars with more caution than passion, wary of drifting into romanticized myth. Yet the enduring fascination with their potential connection to Mary Magdalene speaks to something deeper, a longing to recover chapters of history deliberately obscured. Whether the Templars guarded physical evidence of Magdalene's role or simply embodied a tradition that valued her teachings in symbolic form, their story invites us to question the boundaries between sanctioned history and the undercurrents that shaped medieval consciousness. In the end, the truth may lie somewhere between legend and fact. The Knights Templar, wandering between battlefield and sanctuary, carried with them a secret identity woven from countless influences, some spiritual, some political, some perhaps far more ancient than their order. And in those shadows, the figure of Mary Magdalene lingers like a quiet flame, illuminating corridors of memory that have refused to be fully extinguished. Across the medieval landscapes of Europe, stone became a language, one that outlived kings, survived crusades, endured inquisitions, and whispered meanings long after its builders turned to dust. Cathedrals rose like mountains of carved memory, their walls layered with symbols that seemed to speak in riddles. Travelers stepping through their doors often felt a sense of awe that went beyond architecture. It was as if every vaulted ceiling, Every stained glass window, every carved figure was part of a message concealed in plain sight. And for those who look closely, these spaces may carry traces of a story far older and far more subversive than the official narratives of the time. The story of Mary Magdalene. Medieval artisans rarely had the freedom to express ideas openly, especially when those ideas diverged from church orthodoxy. Yet symbolism offered a subtle escape. A flower carved into a pillar, a figure placed slightly out of sequence, a gesture frozen in stone. These were safe enough to avoid suspicion, yet potent enough to carry hidden meaning for those who knew how to read them. Nowhere is this more apparent than in southern France, where legends of Magdalene's presence remain strongest. In churches from Vézelay to Saint Maximin, iconography subtly deviates from traditional portrayals, hinting at a role beyond that of a penitent sinner. One of the most striking symbols recurring across these sites is the rose, sometimes depicted openly, other times stylized into geometric patterns woven into capitals, floor tiles, and stained glass. The rose, long associated with secrecy and sacred knowledge, appears in places where its presence cannot be dismissed as mere decoration. In some cathedrals, its five-petaled form echoes the rosy mystica, a symbol later adopted by esoteric orders. Whether intentionally or by cultural intuition, it seems to hint at a feminine spiritual source, a lineage or wisdom tradition carried quietly through the Middle Ages. Then there are the Black Madonnas, dark-skinned statues of Mary or maternal figures found in countless shrines across Europe. Their origins remain enigmatic. Some interpretations view them not as depictions of the Virgin Mary, but as symbolic representations of an older, veiled feminine archetype. In regions associated with Magdalene, these statues often receive veneration that predates formal church approval. Their presence inside chapels and crypts, radiating an earthy, ancient aura, suggests a continuity of devotion unbroken by the sweeping reforms of medieval Christianity. To many, they represent the resilience of the sacred feminine, one that the institutional church tried to confine to a narrow role but could never fully erase. Art historians examining medieval frescoes often note scenes where Mary Magdalene stands unusually close to Christ or is depicted larger than expected, sometimes even positioned in places of prominence typically reserved for apostles. A tilt of the head, a hand placed upon a shoulder, a deliberate alignment within the composition. These subtle artistic choices challenge the reduced narrative the church later enforced. In some works, Magdalene's garment colors match Christ's more closely than those of the apostles, suggesting an intentional visual relationship. While officially dismissed as artistic creativity, the pattern is too consistent across regions and centuries to be accidental. Architecture itself also carries hidden messages. Gothic cathedrals, with their labyrinthine floor designs, are especially intriguing. The famous labyrinth at Chartres Cathedral has often been interpreted as a symbolic pilgrimage, a journey inward towards spiritual truth. Some researchers propose that such designs were influenced by earlier initiatory traditions that honored both masculine and feminine aspects of divine wisdom. Magdalene, associated in certain teachings with inner knowledge and mystical vision, fits seamlessly into this symbolic framework. Whether or not she inspired these labyrinths, the alignment of themes is difficult to ignore. Even the structure of certain cathedrals raises questions. Some orientation patterns align with celestial events linked to the cycle of the sun or constellations traditionally associated with feminine deities or wisdom figures. Though medieval architects did not openly discuss esoteric symbolism, their craftsmanship reveals an understanding of sacred geometry that transcends ordinary construction. Hidden proportions, numerical sequences, and repeating motifs hint at a philosophical worldview where every stone contributed to a greater spiritual narrative. Among the most mysterious examples of coded art are the carvings found in churches connected to Templar patronage or influence. Figures holding chalices, women with flowing hair standing near symbols of resurrection, and enigmatic roses nestled beside crosses suggest a symbolic language that differs from conventional doctrine. While safe enough to be dismissed as artistic flourishes, these elements gain new meaning when viewed through the lens of Magdalene's hidden legacy. If the Templars indeed held alternative traditions, these carvings may reflect echoes of those teachings woven into the fabric of holy places. The medieval mind was far more comfortable with symbolism than the modern one. Artists and masons saw their work as part of a sacred science, where spiritual truth was expressed through pattern and proportion. For them, stone was not merely structural, it was revelatory. To encode a forbidden idea in a sculpture or window was not rebellion, it was devotion. And if that forbidden idea was the recognition of Magdalene as a spiritual teacher or bearer of hidden wisdom, the cathedrals themselves become silent witnesses to an alternative spiritual history. Over centuries, many of these symbols faded into the background. Tourists walked past carved roses without realizing their significance. The Black Madonnas became curiosities rather than icons of ancient power. Frescoes darkened, their messages blurred by time. Yet even in their muted state, these artworks hold a presence that resonates with visitors. There's an undeniable feeling that something deeper lies beneath the surface, a memory preserved in silence. As the modern world rediscovers interest in sacred geometry, feminine mysticism, and alternative histories, the coded language of medieval cathedrals has begun to reawaken. Scholars, enthusiasts, and spiritual seekers return to these spaces not just for their beauty, but for the possibility that they conceal a forgotten story. A story in which Magdalene is not a footnote, but a guiding light. A story in which stone, art, and sacred space were crafted to keep her memory alive in an age determined to obscure it. Through these carvings, windows, and architectural mysteries, medieval Europe may have left behind a quiet testimony, a map of symbols pointing toward a legacy preserved not in official documents, but in the enduring language of stone. For centuries, stories of the Holy Grail have drifted across the European imagination like a veil of mist, always present, always elusive, always shimmering just beyond the reach of certainty. Most people imagine a chalice, a cup held by Christ at the Last Supper, infused with divine sanctity. Yet the earliest Grail tales do not agree on its shape, its purpose, or even its material form. Some describe a stone fallen from heaven. Others speak of a radiant vessel carried by a mysterious maiden. And in many versions, especially the older ones, the Grail has almost nothing to do with the Passion story at all. Its meaning is fluid, symbolic, constantly shifting, like an idea too powerful to crystallize into a simple object. As scholars sift through these contradictions, a striking realization emerges. The Grail may never have been meant as a literal chalice. Instead, it may represent a concealed body of knowledge, a lineage of spiritual insight preserved by those who walked outside the boundaries of official doctrine. And among the figures associated with such hidden wisdom, Mary Magdalene stands at the center like an unacknowledged axis. If the Grail is not a cup, but a chronicle, an encoded legacy, then her presence within the Grail traditions becomes not an anomaly, but a key. In the earliest French romances, the Grail bearers are not monks or warriors, but women. Enigmatic women who appear suddenly, carrying vessels that defy simple explanation. They move between worlds, guiding wounded kings and seeking out chosen knights. One such figure, often unnamed, mirrors the attributes later associated with Magdalene. A keeper of sacred knowledge, a link between suffering and redemption, a custodian of mysteries too potent for ordinary understanding. Her role is not passive. She is the agent of awakening. This alone hints at a deeper meaning, one that elevates the feminine principle to a place of spiritual authority rarely acknowledged in medieval Christianity. Writers like Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach, working in a world where heresy and orthodoxy clashed violently, cloaked their narratives in dense allegory. Their tales unfold in shadowed forests, ruined kingdoms, and castles that appear only to vanish, as though they occupy a realm halfway between dream and revelation. The wounded fisher king, whose land falls into desolation because of an unasked question, becomes a symbol of a world cut off from its true source of wisdom. The unasked question, what is the Grail, and whom does it serve, resonates like a quiet indictment against the spiritual authority of the age. If one interprets the Grail as hidden teaching, suppressed lineage, or sacred truth, the wounded king becomes a metaphor for a broken world, one where official institutions ignored or erased alternative voices. The desolation reflects a collective forgetting, and the healing of the king, achieved only when the seeker understands the true nature of the Grail, suggests the restoration of a wisdom lost or deliberately obscured. In this light, the Grail becomes a symbol of continuity, not the continuity of relics or royal bloodlines, but the persistence of teachings rooted in compassion, insight, and spiritual equality, teachings associated in various traditions with Mary Magdalene. Her portrayal in Gnostic texts as a visionary, interpreter, and beloved companion of Christ diverges sharply from the later reduction of her image. If those teachings were suppressed, then storytellers may have chosen to preserve fragments of them in allegory, embedding truths in tales where censors would see only fantasy. The Grail romances also align with the regions in which Magdalene's influence remained strongest. Southern France, especially the Languedoc, was a fertile ground for both troubadour poetry and heterodox spirituality. Here, songs of courtly love blended seamlessly with metaphysical symbolism. The beloved in these poems is not merely a woman, but an embodiment of divine wisdom, an echo of the Sophia tradition, which shares roots with the teachings attributed to Magdalene. The language of love became a language of secrecy, allowing ideas to survive beneath the surface of seemingly romantic verse. When viewed through this lens, the symbolism of the Grail acquires new dimensions. The vessel becomes a container of remembrance. The quest becomes a journey toward a forgotten truth. The keeper of the Grail becomes a guardian of a lineage marginalized by official narratives. And the famous phrase, the Grail family, in some later interpretations transforms from a literal genealogy into a chain of spiritual inheritance. Those who preserve an alternative understanding of the sacred. Even the transformation of the Grail from a stone to a vessel across various texts mirrors the shifting nature of hidden knowledge. A stone suggests permanence, foundation, the unchanging core of wisdom. A vessel suggests transmission, receptivity, the capacity to hold and pour out insight. Both images carry feminine resonance. Earth and womb, sanctuary and offering. Over time, as political and religious forces tightened their grip on European thought, the Grail became increasingly sanitized. Its mysteries were flattened into a relic hunt, its allegories recast as moral lessons. But the deeper strands of the legend refused to disappear. Poets and mystics continued to reinterpret it, sensing that beneath the surface lay something profound, a memory carried through generations, waiting for the right eyes to see. In modern discussions, the Grail is often intertwined with speculative theories, bloodline narratives, secret marriages, hidden dynasties. Whether literal or symbolic, these ideas point to the same intuition, that the Grail is not an object, but a story, a legacy that survived through metaphor when it could no longer survive in plain sight. If Magdalene was indeed the bearer of teachings that challenged established structures, then the Grail romances may represent the last surviving embers of a tradition preserved through poetry, artistry, and coded myth. Ultimately, the Grail can be seen as a mirror. It reflects the questions of each age rather than definitive answers. In the Middle Ages, it spoke to longing for spiritual healing. In later centuries, it became a symbol of lost wisdom. Today, it invites a reconsideration of voices that history muted. And at the center of that reflection stands Mary Magdalene, mysterious, luminous, half-hidden yet ever-present, a figure whose legacy may be the very essence that the Grail stories sought to protect. Through these layered tales and coded allegories, the medieval world may have preserved the memory of an alternative sacred path, carried forward not by armies or institutions, but by storytellers whose words outlived both. There comes a moment in every story when silence grows louder than words. In the centuries following the early Christian era, that silence became a deliberate tool, a sculpting instrument used by empires and councils to reshape memory itself. What the world remembers of Mary Magdalene today is not an accident of history, but the result of a long, calculated process. Her role, once vibrant and complex, was gradually recast, reframed, and reduced until little remained of the teachings and authority attributed to her in earlier traditions. This was not a single act, nor the work of a single churchman, but a slow constriction unfolding over hundreds of years, tightening like a noose around the narratives deemed too dangerous to survive. As Christianity spread across the Roman world, diversity in belief flourished. Communities in Alexandria, Antioch, Edessa, and Gaul held varying interpretations of Christ's teachings. Some honored Magdalene as a spiritual equal, a visionary whose understanding surpassed that of many apostles. Others saw her as a symbol of the soul's ascent, interpreting her dialogues in mystical texts as allegories for inner transformation. But such multiplicity posed a threat to the emerging institutional church, which sought unity through uniformity. In this environment, theological authority became a political necessity, and figures who offered alternative perspectives naturally drew suspicion. The process of silencing began with the shaping of canonical scripture. While this was not a malicious act in itself, it inevitably excluded voices that did not align with the theological vision preferred by powerful leaders. Texts such as the Gospel of Mary, which depicted her as a trusted interpreter of Christ's wisdom, found no place in the official compilation. Their omission created a vacuum that later generations rarely questioned. What was left became the truth, and what was excluded faded into the shadows. Councils convened throughout the early centuries contributed to this narrowing. Debates that once included a wide range of beliefs crystallized into fixed doctrine. The Church Fathers wrote eloquent treatises condemning what they deemed heresies, often using language that blurred intellectual disagreement with moral failure. Through these writings, an alternative Mary Magdalene emerged, one stripped of authority and recast as a repentant sinner. It was a narrative that served both theological and social interests, reinforcing a hierarchy in which spiritual leadership was strictly masculine. Art followed doctrine. In churches and manuscripts, Magdalene's depiction shifted dramatically. Gone were the images of her standing as an equal among disciples or receiving visions. In their place appeared the familiar motif of the weeping penitent, her long hair a symbol of repentance rather than insight. This new imagery spread rapidly, shaping popular understanding more effectively than any council decree. People saw in her not a teacher, but a warning, an example of what must be overcome, not what might be celebrated. By the High Middle Ages, the silencing became more forceful. The Great Inquisitions, while primarily aimed at political dissent and theological challenge, inadvertently, or perhaps intentionally, erased communities that preserved stories and teachings at odds with official positions. Movements like the Cathars, who honored a more balanced and mystical interpretation of Christianity, were eradicated with brutal efficiency. Their writings were burned, their leaders executed, their towns razed. Within their worldview, Magdalene stood as a figure of knowledge and spiritual purity. Her elevated status could not survive the tide that swept them away. Even scholars of the era sensed the shift. Chronicles from monastic scriptoria occasionally hint at lost texts, strange traditions, or alternate stories reluctantly dismissed as superstition. They speak of dangerous writings, forbidden gospels, and teachings not suited for public ears. Though these descriptions are vague, they illustrate a world where certain ideas circulated beneath the surface, ideas that the Church worked tirelessly to contain. The suppression of these narratives was not solely about theology. It was also about power. A Magdalene portrayed as an enlightened teacher threatened the carefully constructed hierarchy of the medieval church. Her presence challenged a notion that spiritual authority flowed exclusively through ordained male leadership. If she were acknowledged as a central figure in early Christianity, the implications would ripple outward, destabilizing centuries of structure. Thus, her story was confined to safe territory, an exemplar of repentance rather than revelation, a follower rather than a founder. Over time, the manufactured version of Magdalene became indistinguishable from memory itself. Generations grew up knowing her only as the woman with the alabaster jar, the one cleansed of 7 demons, the one who wept at the tomb. The deeper layers of her legacy faded, hidden beneath centuries of recasting. In sermons, she became a symbol of moral correction. In art, a symbol of sensuality redeemed. In popular thought, a figure defined by sorrow rather than wisdom. Yet even in this great silencing, fragments survived. Echoes lingered in remote monasteries, in whispered folk tales, in symbols woven into tapestries and stained glass. Troubadours sang of a lady of light, whose wisdom sustained forgotten kingdoms. Hermits in the hills of Provence kept alive traditions linking her to sacred groves and hidden shrines. These remnants, subtle and fragile, carried an undercurrent that refused to vanish completely. The suppression was deep, but never absolute. Something in her story resonated too strongly, endured too vividly, to be fully extinguished. The figure of Magdalene reemerged again and again, not in official doctrine, but in the hearts of those seeking a different kind of spiritual truth. Even as the Church's narrative hardened into dogma, her presence remained like an ember glowing beneath layers of ash. The great silencing shaped the world's understanding of Magdalene, but it did not erase her. Instead, it created 2 parallel versions of her story, one sanctioned, one suppressed. And as history moved forward, cracks appeared in the official narrative, allowing glimpses of the forgotten Magdalene to return. First through scholars, then through mystics, and finally through modern seekers who sensed that her legacy held more meaning than the penitential mask placed upon her. What was lost during those centuries may never be fully recovered, but the shadows themselves tell a story of power, of memory, and of a woman whose voice, though muted, continues to echo through time. When the medieval world finally gave way to the dawning brilliance of the Renaissance, Europe entered a period of profound rediscovery. Ancient manuscripts resurfaced, long silent philosophies gained new breath, and artists began to view the human spirit with a sense of reverence that had been dormant for centuries. It was a time when stone and parchment seemed to tremble with possibility, when every workshop and studio became a laboratory of rebirth. Amidst this transformation, figures long obscured by dogma began to re-emerge in unexpected ways. And gently, almost imperceptibly, the memory of Mary Magdalene slipped back into the cultural imagination, not as a penitent sinner, but as a symbol of wisdom, mystery, and inner illumination. Artists of the Renaissance operated under a delicate balance. They lived in a world still heavily shaped by church authority, yet they were inspired by ancient ideas that encouraged curiosity, innovation, and symbolic depth. Their paintings and sculptures, though outwardly conforming to religious expectations, often carried subtle layers of meaning. Messages hidden in gestures, color choices, spatial relationships, and the interplay of light and shadow. It is within these layers that Magdalene's older, more complex identity flickered back to life. In the works of Leonardo da Vinci, this subtle revival becomes particularly fascinating. Leonardo was not a man who left anything to accident. Every figure, every fold of fabric, every angle of a hand held symbolic weight. Though he never wrote directly about Magdalene in his surviving notebooks, her presence haunts some of his most enigmatic works. In his representations of the sacred, women often appear with an unusual depth of expression, the kind that suggests knowledge, not submission. Their eyes hold secrets. Their posture reflects agency. Even in group scenes, their placement challenges conventional hierarchy. In certain paintings attributed to Leonardo or his workshop, Magdalene is portrayed not as the broken woman of medieval imagination, but as a contemplative figure, a bearer of memory. Her garments echo the hues associated with Sophia, the embodiment of wisdom in ancient traditions. Her features are rendered with a softness that suggests inner clarity rather than sorrow. For Renaissance viewers attuned to symbolism, these artistic decisions would not have gone unnoticed. They hinted at a more dignified role, one that aligned with the re-emerging fascination with Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, and esoteric Christianity. Botticelli, too, touched upon themes that resonate with Magdalene's legacy. In his mythological works, the divine feminine appears as beauty, grace, and transformative power. While these scenes ostensibly depict classical stories, some scholars believe they conceal allegories about spiritual rebirth and hidden knowledge, echoing ideas found in suppressed Christian texts. Botticelli's women stand at the threshold between the earthly and divine, offering guidance, awakening, and renewal. These motifs mirror the descriptions of Magdalene found in Gnostic writings, where she appears as a visionary whose understanding exceeds that of many of her male counterparts. The Renaissance was not merely an artistic revolution, it was an intellectual one. Scholars pored over rediscovered manuscripts from antiquity, works on mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and metaphysics. Among these teachings, ideas about the balance of masculine and feminine forces resurfaced, often drawn from sources considered heretical in the Middle Ages. Hermetic texts described the universe as a marriage of opposites. Alchemical writings spoke of the union of sun and moon, sulfur and mercury, king and queen. In this symbolic language, the feminine was not a subordinate figure, but an essential half of creation. Within this philosophical framework, Magdalene's earlier role made sense in a way it had not for medieval theologians. Her depiction as a vessel of hidden understanding aligned with the Renaissance fascination for esoteric knowledge. The possibility that she carried teachings suppressed by orthodox authorities resonated with thinkers who saw themselves as reclaiming lost wisdom from the ruins of antiquity. Even when not referenced directly, she hovered at the edges of their rediscovered cosmology, an embodiment of the very principles they sought to revive. Architects of the period also contributed to this quiet reawakening. Building on medieval foundations, they infused sacred spaces with newfound attention to proportion, light, and symbolic geometry. Cathedrals and chapels were designed to reflect cosmic harmony, aligning architecture with celestial patterns. In these designs, one finds motifs associated with sacred femininity woven subtly into stone and glass. A rose window placed with unusual prominence, a figure carved in a quiet corner with a book pressed to her chest, a triangular arrangement of figures suggesting the hidden trinity of wisdom. These were not arbitrary decorations, but deliberate choices made by minds steeped in symbolism. The Black Madonna cults, too, experienced renewed interest during the Renaissance. People flocked to shrines where dark-skinned figures radiated an ancient, earthy presence. While officially recognized by the Church, these statues carried layers of meaning that had little connection to Orthodox doctrine. Many communities believe these figures embodied a deeper feminine spiritual force, one older than Marian devotion and resistant to the pressures of historical suppression. Their persistence speaks to a memory that refused to disappear, a thread that connected the Renaissance back to the world of forgotten gospels and hidden teachings. As Europe awakened intellectually, poetry also became a vessel for veiled remembrance. Renaissance poets explored themes of courtly love, mystical longing, and sacred union. Their verses often portrayed the beloved woman as a guide, a source of insight, a bridge between earthly desire and divine understanding. These poems were not merely romantic. They carried spiritual undertones that mirrored the symbolic language of earlier heterodox movements. The beloved in these poems can be seen as a reflection of the forgotten Magdalene, whose voice once guided seekers in texts excluded from the canon. Through these artistic and intellectual channels, the Renaissance did not restore Mary Magdalene to her full ancient stature, but it reopened the doorway through which her deeper story could be glimpsed. She re-entered the cultural consciousness not as a marginal figure, but as a symbol of hidden potential, of wisdom rediscovered, of truth resurfacing through art, philosophy, and imagination. Her legacy became intertwined with the rebirth of knowledge itself. The great irony is that Renaissance thinkers, though surrounded by the symbols of her revival, rarely recognized how completely she had once been eclipsed. They sensed her presence, felt the pull of her forgotten story, and wove fragments of it into their masterpieces. Without knowing it, they kept alive the memory of a woman whose influence had been nearly erased, a quiet defiance against centuries of suppression. In the soft glow of frescoes, in the delicate lines of sketches, in the proportions of sacred spaces, and in the poetry whispered in candlelit rooms, the Renaissance allowed Magdalene to step forward again, not as a penitent, but as a muse of wisdom, an echo of a spiritual lineage waiting patiently to rise once more. In the soft glow of many contemporary spiritual circles, meditation halls, and esoteric gatherings, a subtle awakening is underway, quiet, understated, yet undeniably powerful. It is a movement without a central leader, without a formal doctrine, without a single manifesto to proclaim its existence. And yet it spreads, carried through conversations, online communities, whispered teachings, and the growing hunger for a spirituality that transcends rigid boundaries. At the heart of this unfolding revival lies a figure once pushed to the margins of memory, Mary Magdalene. Not the repentant caricature constructed by centuries of distortion, but the teacher, the visionary, the companion, the bearer of hidden understanding. Her legacy, once buried beneath layers of dogma, is rising into the consciousness of a generation seeking depth, balance, and truth. This renewed interest is not driven by sensationalism, though the modern world is full of it. Instead, it emerges from something quieter, a longing for a spiritual lineage that honors both intellect and intuition, both action and contemplation, both masculine and feminine energies. Many people today sense an imbalance in the traditions handed down to them, an absence where something essential should have been. They speak of a missing voice, a missing presence, a missing half of the sacred story. As they explore ancient texts, alternative histories, and the symbolic languages forgotten by mainstream discourse, They find themselves drawn repeatedly toward a name that has endured through centuries of silence. Magdalene's presence in modern spirituality is not confined to historical studies. It permeates practices of inner work. In meditation groups focused on heart-centered awareness, participants often invoke a feminine guide whose qualities mirror those attributed to Magdalene in suppressed writings. Compassion grounded in clarity, wisdom that cuts through illusion, courage that stands firm against injustice. In gatherings dedicated to sacred femininity, her story becomes a point of reflection, a reminder that leadership is not domination but presence, not authority but authenticity. The rise of interest in gnosis, the direct, experiential knowledge of the divine, has also intersected with Magdalene's modern revival. Contemporary seekers who explore Gnostic texts find in her a figure uniquely aligned with their path. Someone who valued personal insight over fixed doctrine. Someone who challenged the idea that truth must pass through institutional gatekeepers. Her dialogues, preserved in fragments across various non-canonical sources, speak of inner transformation rather than external obedience. For those disillusioned with rigid frameworks, these teachings resonate with a clarity that feels timeless. Therapists, writers, and scholars of comparative religion note that Magdalene's resurgence coincides with broader cultural shifts. As discussions about gender, identity, and power dynamics have intensified, so too has interest in reclaiming erased female voices from history. Magdalene stands at the intersection of these movements, not only as a historical figure, but as a symbol of resilience. Her story reflects the experiences of countless women whose contributions were undervalued or overwritten. To explore her legacy is, in many ways, to participate in a larger effort to restore balance and justice to the historical record. Artists of the modern era, painters, poets, filmmakers, digital creators, have also embraced her narrative with renewed fascination. They portray her not as a broken woman seeking redemption, but as a contemplative figure caught between worlds, the physical and the mystical, the personal and the cosmic. In galleries across Europe and North America, contemporary works depict her as a teacher cradling scrolls of hidden knowledge, or as a traveler walking alone through ancient landscapes, her eyes fixed not on the past, but on what lies beyond the horizon. These artistic reinterpretations reflect the same longing that drives scholarly inquiry, the desire to see her as she might have been, not as centuries of retelling forced her to become. Modern pilgrimage has also taken on new forms. Travelers visit sites associated with Magdalene in southern France, where local traditions speak of her arrival by sea, carrying with her teachings that influenced entire communities. Others journey to Egypt, Israel, or the ruins of early Christian settlements, seeking the landscapes where her authentic story may have unfolded. For many, these journeys are not attempts to prove historical claims, but efforts to connect with a lineage of spiritual courage. They walk paths shaped by myth and memory, allowing both to coexist without contradiction. In academic circles, a growing number of scholars approach Magdalene not as a footnote to the life of Jesus, but as a significant figure in early Christian thought. Conferences on early Christian diversity increasingly include sessions dedicated to her role in heterodox communities. Papers explore the symbolic language used to describe her, the theological implications of her dialogues in non-canonical texts, and the possibility that she represented a strand of Christianity focused on inner transformation. Though debates remain heated, the mere presence of these discussions marks a profound shift from previous centuries. Meanwhile, psychological and archetypal interpretations have woven Magdalene into the fabric of individual transformation. Jungian therapists speak of her as an archetype of the wounded healer, the guide through shadow into integration, the embodiment of sacred intimacy with one's own inner truth. In this context, her story becomes deeply personal. It reflects the journey of confronting broken narratives, those imposed by others and those we impose upon ourselves, and reclaiming a truer identity beneath them. Across social media, podcasts, and discussion forums, people share their own interpretations of her story, their own experiences of encountering her presence in meditation, prayer, or synchronicity. These accounts, though varied and subjective, reveal a collective longing for guidance that is both gentle and firm, compassionate and incisive. Many describe Magdalene not as a distant saint, but as a companion in their search for meaning, someone whose humanity makes her wisdom all the more accessible. In interfaith spaces, her figure emerges as a bridge between traditions. Mystics in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam find resonances between her story and the feminine dimensions of the divine present in their own teachings. Some see her as connected to the ancient wisdom of Sophia, the embodiment of divine understanding. Others view her as a counterpart to feminine figures in Sufi poetry or Kabbalistic symbolism. Though these connections are not historical in the conventional sense, they reflect a universal archetype, one that transcends doctrine and speaks to something deeper in the human psyche. The resurgence of interest in Magdalene is not uniform, nor is it without controversy. Debates flare between historians and mystics, between theologians and alternative researchers, between those who seek empirical evidence and those who trust intuition. Yet in these debates, one truth becomes unmistakably clear. Her story is alive again. It is alive not because of certainty, but because of possibility. Not because of dogma, but because of curiosity. Not because of authority, but because of personal resonance. She returns not as a figure to be worshipped, but as a voice to be heard. Not as a symbol of sin, but as a symbol of wisdom. Not as a shadow in the background of someone else's narrative, but as a beacon guiding seekers toward understanding themselves and their place within the greater tapestry of history and spirit. And in this modern revival, one senses that her legacy is only beginning to unfold. Her voice, once silenced, is rising again, not through the power of institutions, but through the quiet determination of those who refuse to let forgotten wisdom fade forever into the shadows. In the final quiet moments of this long journey, when the echoes of centuries begin to soften and the threads of history settle into place, one truth becomes unmistakably clear. The story of Mary Magdalene is not a tale confined to the past. It is not a relic to be sealed behind museum glass or a footnote in the margins of Scripture. It is a living current, subtle, persistent, woven through the fabric of time with the stubborn resilience of something that refuses to be forgotten. As we stand at the threshold between what was and what might yet be, her presence lingers like a candle flame in a darkened room, steady and unwavering. The deeper one travels into her world, the more complex her legacy becomes. She is a paradox, both hidden and luminous, erased and remembered, diminished and exalted. The silence that enveloped her for centuries was not the silence of absence, but the silence of something waiting for a world capable of hearing nuance, waiting for generations willing to question old narratives, waiting for seekers who could read between lines, listen to whispers, and recognize the profound impact of a single voice carried through time. It is tempting to imagine that her story ends with the discoveries, the theories, the restored manuscripts, and the artistic reinterpretations of recent years. But her legacy stretches beyond academia, beyond theology, beyond the debates that rage across lecture halls and online forums. It reaches into something more intimate, more human, a quiet recognition that history is not merely a record of events, but a living dialogue between the past and the present. And in that dialogue, Magdalene has stepped forward again, not as a myth, but as a reminder of what is possible when truth refuses to die. When we trace her footsteps across ancient landscapes, from the deserts of Judea to the shores of the Mediterranean, from hidden caves to candlelit chapels, we begin to see a woman who has carried many roles across time. She has been portrayed as disciple, confidant, visionary, apostle, exile, teacher, witness, and wanderer. But beneath all these layers lies a deeper identity, a keeper of memory. Not just her own memory, but a collective memory of what early spiritual movements once valued: inner knowledge, balance, partnership, and the sacred dignity of each human being. Her story reminds us that history is shaped not only by the voices that are preserved, but by the silences that are imposed. The absence of her words in canonical text speaks as loudly as any recorded sermon or epistle. It reveals the forces that sought to control narrative, consolidate authority, and reshape the spiritual landscape to fit a singular mold. And yet, despite all attempts to obscure her, she survived. Through symbols, through local traditions, through art, through unnamed references, through the quiet loyalty of those who believed her story mattered. As we reflect on her journey, we are confronted with a question that lingers softly, like a breath on the edge of consciousness. Why does her story resonate so deeply now, in this century, in this moment? Perhaps it is because the world itself is searching for balance. For a long time, global narratives have been dominated by structures that prioritize power over wisdom, instruction over understanding, hierarchy over partnership. Magdalene's legacy challenges these assumptions. It whispers of a time when spirituality was not a ladder to climb, but a path to walk together. Her presence calls the modern world to reconsider what was lost when one voice was elevated above another, when one perspective became the standard by which all others were judged. And in this reconsideration, something profound occurs. Her story becomes not only a historical recovery, but a mirror. When people look into that mirror, they see the missing pieces within their own lives, the unspoken truths, the inner wisdom waiting to be reclaimed, the courage to question boundaries that once seemed immovable. In her, they recognize the part of themselves that has long been overshadowed by expectations or silenced by tradition. Her journey becomes a metaphor for their own. Even now, her legacy continues to expand. Researchers dive deeper into forgotten archives. Artists reinterpret her presence with bold new vision. Pilgrims walk ancient routes with reverence and curiosity. Scholars debate her role with a passion once reserved for far more established figures. And ordinary people, those with no academic credentials or institutional backing, find comfort in her story, strength in her resilience, and inspiration in the possibility that truth can rise even from centuries of suppression. As this modern rediscovery unfolds, it becomes clear that Magdalene does not return as a figure to replace anything or anyone. She returns as a bridge between masculine and feminine, between history and myth, between past and future, between external teachings and inner wisdom. Her presence invites integration, not division. Understanding, not dogma. Curiosity, not fear. And perhaps that is the quiet power of her enduring influence. She teaches without speaking. Her silence has become its own language, one that encourages questioning, contemplation, and the courage to seek one's own understanding of the sacred. In this way, she becomes both guide and companion, walking alongside those who search for meaning in the labyrinth of modern life. In the end, her story is not simply about her. It is about all the forgotten voices across history, all the wisdom smothered beneath authority, all the human experiences reduced to footnotes. It invites us to imagine a world where knowledge is shared, not controlled, where spiritual paths honor diversity rather than conformity, where history acknowledges its omissions and dares to fill them with honesty. As this journey draws to a close, imagine standing at the threshold of an ancient chapel, the air cool and still, the scent of stone and candle wax lingering in the quiet. The walls around you hold centuries of prayer, longing, grief, and revelation. And somewhere within that silence, you sense a presence, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady, familiar, and unexpectedly near. A presence shaped by resilience, softened by compassion, sharpened by insight. A presence that has survived storms of erasure and emerged with a clarity that feels almost eternal. The journey ends here, but her story does not. It continues in every question you carry, every mystery you explore, every piece of history you choose to examine with both intellect and intuition. It continues in the quiet spaces where truth whispers beneath the noise. And perhaps, in the softest way imaginable, it continues in you. For legacies like hers do not fade. They wait. They endure. They rise when the world is ready to hear them again.